gang. My name is Dr. Tim Oliver, and I'm the Director of Bands at Arkansas State University. Believe it or not, I used to be a beginning percussionist. Today on this video, I'd like to share a few tips and strategies that might help you as a beginning percussionist as you continue to learn how to play the snare drum. The three things that we're going to talk about today are going to be: 1, how to set up your snare drum; 2, the proper way to hold your sticks; and 3, we'll talk about one of the rudiments that the snare drummers have to use, the long roll. You ready to get started? Here we go. All right, before we get started, I have 2 quick things to talk about. First, any of the suggestions that I have during this video are just that. They're suggestions. So if your band director or your percussion teacher has something that they prefer or something that they would like you to do, you should listen to them, because they probably know something about your particular set of equipment or something that's particular to your school that I may not. Secondly, you'll find as a percussionist, there's lots of different types of equipment. There's lots of different types of drums. There's lots of different types of keyboard instruments. There's lots of different types of timpani. There's lots of different types of mallets, hardware, stands, everything. So the equipment that I show you today on this video may not exactly look like the equipment that you have, and that's okay. I want to tell you a little secret. Do you know how long I've had my snare drum that I'm going to show you here in just a second? Almost 40 years. This is the same snare drum that I started with when I was in beginning band in 5th grade in 1981. So your snare drum and your snare drum stand and other pieces of equipment might look a little bit different, and that's okay. The idea and the concepts are the same. Okay, here we go. So the first thing as far as setting up your snare drum is your stand. And we start with the lower part of the stand. Now you may need to unscrew just a little bit this wing nut or whatever fastener that you have on your snare drum stand, but you'll notice that I put it down just far enough, and then I'll tighten it up just a little bit. And I have a mark here on my snare drum stand. You may not be able to see it, but it's a little Sharpie marker that I've put just a little line here, so that way I know exactly how far to unfold my snare drum stand every time, so that way I take all the guesswork out of it, so I can be consistent with it every time. So I'll put that in place here, and I'll pick up the top portion of my stand. Now again, your top portion of your stand may look different. I suspect most of your stands have 3 arms on it that kind of look like a claw, and they come up and grab your snare drum, and that's fine. It's the same concept. If you have a stand that looks like this, you're just going to unfold it and try to make it out to a right angle or close to a right angle as you can. And you'll notice here that I have this piece of blue tape on my stand. And the reason for that is so that way I know exactly how far to put the top part of my stand into the bottom part of my snare drum stand. So I'll stick, here we go. Then I'll just tighten that screw. Then I'll unfold the arms like that. Now the reason why it's so important to have your snare drum stand at the right height is so that you can have the correct playing position. So let me grab my snare drum here. And again, your snare drum may look a little bit different, but notice mine has the clear bottom head, the snare is on the bottom, and then of course the top head. And right here is my snare release lever. And I point this out here in just a second, but the first step as far as setting up your snare drum is that you want, with the snare in your hand, is that you want the snare release lever facing you. And the reason for that is that there are times that you have to release the snares on your snare drum, and you have to do that rather quickly. And so you want it to have, you want to have access right here as easy and as quick as possible. If you're, just imagine here for a moment, if your snare release lever was over here, you have to reach over here or something like that. Whereas if it's right here in front of you, you can do that very quickly and very easily. The other thing about the snare release lever is that you might have noticed already in beginning band or in your band class that sometimes when other instruments are playing, your snare drum makes sound, even though no one is playing your snare drum. So your band director may ask you to have your snares turned off, and you can just unhinge the snare release lever, and that way you won't have those sounds. And then when you're ready to play, you can quickly and quietly, you want to do this as quietly as possible, re-engage the snares so that you can play. So I'm going to reach down and pick up a pair of snare drum sticks here, and I'm going to once again demonstrate why it's so important to have your snare drum at just the right height. Notice here on me, I'm fairly tall, but on the snare drum, for me, it's right just a tiny little bit beyond, lower than my belly button. That's where you want your snare drum to be. Think about this for a second. If my snare drum is too high, think about a T-Rex, right? I've got this big body and these tiny little arms playing snare drum, right? That's no good because I can't have the right kind of playing position if my snare drum is too high. Conversely, if my snare drum is too low and I'm trying to reach down, then I'm not able to have good playing position and good technique with that either. It's like I'm trying to not play the snare drum because I'm afraid of it or something. So by having the snare drum at this height, you're in an ideal playing position. And you notice here with my arms, I don't want you to take out a protractor or anything like that because everybody's arm's a little bit different. But you'll notice that it's sort of at a right angle right here between my forearm and my elbow. That's a good way to know that if your snare drum is at the right height, because again, if the angle is really shallow, your snare drum's too high, or if the angle is too far, your snare drum is too low. So you want to be here at about belt level so you can have optimal playing position. All right, so the second thing I'd like to talk about is grip. Now that we've got our snare drum sticks, how do we hold them? Well, there's two different types of grips, and you may have heard these terms called match grip and traditional grip. Traditional grip is only going to be used for snare drum, and almost always it's going to be used for when you're outside or possibly in a drum set situation. I personally think that you shouldn't worry about traditional grip until many, many years from now, because matched grip is going to be something that you're going to use on all percussion instruments. So playing with a match grip is, in my opinion, the right thing to do at this point. So what's match grip mean? Match just essentially is your right hand matches your left. They look exactly the same, except it's right versus left. In other words, the technique of holding the sticks are exactly the same. So I'm going to put one stick down for just a moment. And then when I grip the stick with my right hand, a couple of things that I want you to think about as far as suggestions. The back of the stick, I have maybe like an inch or two at the back of the stick. You don't want to be at the very end of the stick, and conversely, you don't want to be choked up on it very much either. You want to have just a little bit sticking out there, the back of your hand. When you turn your hand over, you want to be able to see this part of your hand right here. If your wrist is turned over such that you're seeing your thumb, that's not going to put you in the right or the best angle to make the best possible sound. You want to be in a situation where you can see this part of your hand right here at all times. And if you're really thinking about it, you want to see this section right here the most. That'll tell you if your wrist is in a good position. So you've got your wrist in a good position. What do you do with your fingers? Well, very simply, you're going to take your fingers and wrap them around the stick. Notice that it's not going to be a death grip. I'm not gripping the stick as hard as I can, but your fingers are just wrapped around. I sometimes see young percussionists have their pinkies out like they're going to a tea party or something. You definitely don't want to have that. You want to have all those fingers wrapped around, because at some point someday in your playing, you're going to use your fingers to help just a little bit to produce the sound. And if your fingers are off of the stick, they're not going to be able to help you produce the sound that you want. So keep those fingers around. And lastly, what to do with your thumb. I find it very helpful to keep the center of my thumb right there on the center of the stick. I sometimes see percussionists who they'll have their thumb below the stick or above the stick. You don't want to have that. You want to have the center of your thumb right there in the center of the drumstick. So that way when you turn your hands over, you've got thumb on the side, all four fingers wrapped around, and you can see this part of your hand. Now right here, everybody's hand's a little bit different. There might be a little bit of a gap when you play. Some people there's no gap at all, that's fine. The main thing is you don't want to have this, where you've got all your fingers wrapped around the stick and you've got a big like cave in here. You want to keep that so that that space in between your thumb and your first finger is minimal. So when I take my left hand and I do that same procedure, I make sure I'm gripping the stick in the right spot where I have just a little bit sticking out. And I take all 4 of my fingers, wrap around, put my thumb right on the side, and then turn my hands over. You'll notice now that my hands should look like each other. Now with my snare drum, notice that I have this grip and this stick, the angle from my right to my left is approximately 90 degrees. Again, I don't want you to get your protractors out and measure the angle specifically, but it should be a 90-degree angle between your right hand and your left hand. So let's review real quick. Sticks wrapped around, make sure you can see this part of your hand. You want to make sure that your thumb is on the side and that your sticks are at a 90-degree angle when you start playing. All right, now we get to start playing. There are lots of different rudiments. There's like 40 different rudiments. And all of these rudiments, when you start to learn how to play them, they become the foundation for your technique on playing a snare drum. So the rudiments I want to talk about today are the roll rudiments, specifically the long roll. Now, there are 3 basic types of rolls that we will play as a percussionist. I'm going to talk about each one briefly, but I'm going to talk about the long roll the most. The first is a single stroke roll. Now, the cool thing about a single stroke roll is that you're going to play the single stroke roll on all percussion instruments. So when you're playing a suspended cymbal, or you're playing timpani, or you're playing anything on the keyboard instruments, you're going to be playing a single stroke roll. What is a single stroke roll? Very simply, you're taking your 2 hands, one each, and that's all you're doing, is you're alternating strokes between the hands. Now, did that sound like a roll? No, that didn't sound like a roll because I wasn't moving fast enough. So when I start to move fast enough between my hands, that's when you start to get the roll effect. So I'm going to go from a little bit slower speed and speed it up just a smidge so you start to hear what it might sound like as a roll. So here it is, just a little bit slower still. Now we're going to get faster. So the single stroke roll is really important because you're going to be playing it on every other percussion instrument, snare drum too, but exclusively on timpani, keyboards, and many of the other percussion instruments. So what's the second type of roll? Well, the second type of roll you're only going to use on snare drum, and it's called the buzz roll. Some people may call it the multiple bounce roll, but those 2 terms mean the same thing. So a buzz roll, remember for the single stroke roll, we're only using 1 stroke per hand, right? On a buzz roll, you're still only using 1 stroke, but this time the snare drum stick is going to have multiple bounces on the head. So if I take 1 stroke and isolate it, you're going to hear the difference. So here's what it would sound like as a buzz roll. I'll do that again. So when I put my 2 hands together in a buzz roll, real slow, this is what it might sound like. Now, does that sound like a roll? No, that doesn't sound like a roll either. So what do we have to do? We have to increase the speed of our hands a little bit, and we have to control the bounce. So now I'm going to play it a little bit faster so you hear the difference between the single stroke roll and the buzz roll. So here's a buzz roll just a little bit quicker. Now a little bit quicker yet. All of you have probably heard that sound before. Let me do that one more time. This is what a buzz roll sounds like. And this is what the single stroke roll would sound like. You hear how those 2 things are different. So we have single stroke roll and buzz roll. The third kind of roll, which is the roll that I want to spend the most time on today, is called the long roll. The long roll, another name for that is called the double stroke roll. As you might imagine, when we talked about the single stroke roll, the double stroke roll is exactly the same concept, except instead of one stroke per hand, like the single stroke roll, we now have two. And unlike the buzz roll, where we have multiple bounces and we're maybe not quite sure how many, double stroke roll is just two. All right? Why is the double stroke roll or the long roll so important? Well, it's because it's the foundation for almost all of the other rudiments. When you start to think about a paradiddle, for example, a typical paradiddle, back and forth, the ends of the paradiddles, the last two notes of the paradiddle, are a long roll in isolation. There's many of the rudiments that are foundationally related. The foundation of many of the rudiments is the long roll. Okay, so what is a long roll? A long roll is essentially, as I said, two notes per hand. So slowly, in an open position, it would sound like this. Right? And as I get a little bit faster, eventually at some point I'm going to switch over from two strokes to a stroke and a bounce. And that's how I get this sort of speed. It's going from a stroke to a stroke bounce. Now, what I want to focus on today is the way to get a good long roll is to delay as long as possible that transition point from when you have to use stroke to stroke bounce. And the way to do that is to be able to control with your wrists, not your forearm, but your wrist, the speed at which we can play those two strokes with our hands. So a really good practice technique that I've learned over the years that can help us with that is to put an accent on the second note. What typically happens with a lot of young percussionists when they're playing a long roll for the first time is they get a sound which may sound something like this. Hear how that sound is not very even because there's one accent note, the first, and the second one is almost like an afterthought. If we take that thinking and invert that thinking, so now we have an accent on the second note as opposed to the first, this is what that may sound like. And as you hear, as I start to get faster, I'm still trying to put the accent on the second note. And the whole point of this technique, of this exercise, is to make the notes as even as possible between my two hands. So if I take the accent away now and have a moderate speed, hopefully if I do this right, you'll be able to not tell the difference between my hands and it will sound even. So here we go. I had a little bit of a mess up there at the end, but hopefully you heard how even that was between my two hands. So a practice technique to help you with that is to practice that long roll with an accent on the second note as opposed to the first note. Now, if I were to play the long roll in an open, closed, open style from, as you would as a drum rudiment, this is what it might sound like. All right. So as a quick review on that, we have three different types of rolls. We have the single stroke roll, we have the buzz roll, and then we have the long roll. And the thing that I would encourage you to work on as you continue to develop your skills as a percussionist is, first of all, make sure you know the difference between each of those types of rolls, and then work on the long roll. It might be of the three, and I know there's lots of different opinions on this, it might be of the three the most important in terms of a snare drum type of situation, because someday if you decide to play in a marching band, or if you play solos that are rudimental solos, you're going to have to be able to easily and quickly go among lots of different rudiments. And the rudiment that is the foundation of a lot of the others isn't going to be the long roll. All right? So I hope that this video was helpful to you as a way to keep you motivated and a way to keep you reminded of the fact that there is an infinite distance between 0 and 1. You can continue to practice, you can continue to get better. Music is something that you can do for your entire lifetime. All right? I'm Tim Oliver. Thank you for joining me today.